And yes, very warm welcome to the first panel. One of our panelists is online. That's why I have my mobile phone here, and we don't have 3 seats, but only 2. But hopefully Ray will appear on the screen in a minute. His flight was cancelled at Gatwick last night, and he unfortunately can't be with us today. But we are thrilled that 2 speakers are here and present, and I ask to the stage already Andrea Vetter. Thank you very much for coming. And also Samira Iran. Please come. And Ray is there. Do you want to sit here? And Samira, hello. And Ray, hello. Can you hear us? And can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wow, that was such a smooth tech.
Yeah, I think this is going to work. This is going to work very well. So, greetings to London. I briefly introduced the idea of the panel before I introduce the panelists in more detail. So with this panel, really the aim is to frame the conference conceptually, to think about and have an exchange on the correlation between degrowth and fashion and education. We know that it's wide. We don't have to answer or solve anything in the next half an hour, but we want to open up a field for us for these next 2 days. And maybe I just want to recount a situation I recently found myself in to explain the complexity of this notion of degrowth in relation to fashion and education. I was at the annual meeting of the Union of Concerned Research in Fashion, and I know that some of the fellow members are here today. And one of my colleagues I was talking to about this conference and asking him what he thought of this concept of degrowth. He's a manufacturing manager from Indonesia, and he told me in Indonesia, if you mention the word degrowth, you get thrown out of the room. So we're coming to this term from very different perspectives, and we want to bring those perspectives into this room today. So degrowth holds very different meanings and different contexts without really clear demarcation lines. And we have to ask ourselves, is degrowth an adequate term for the global south? Is it an adequate term for all the different socio-economic classes and cultures in the global north as well? Degrowth really sees this rising and increasingly mainstream debate at a time when the consumption of hyper-fast fashion has never been as successful, as we've also just heard from Sandra, at a time when Shein, for example, today will post 6,000 new styles. And they will do so tomorrow again and the day after tomorrow, every single day. So we have a rising debate around degrowth and fashion at the same time as an incredibly successful hyperfast fashion model. So all of these sort of contradictions and these relations we want to explore. And I'm thrilled that I have the 3 panelists who come from very different perspectives to enlighten us on these correlations. So first of all, I would like to introduce you individually with a quotation that I've taken from one of your works. And by introducing you, I would like to ask you to position yourselves within this space of degrowth, fashion, and education. So Andrea Vetter, a warm welcome to you again. And I've chosen this quotation from your, not the latest book, because you're publishing quite a lot at the moment, but the one beforehand that was published in English last year, from The Future's Degrowth. Degrowth is not the crisis, capitalism is. Andrea Vetter writes, researches, narrates, organizes, teaches, and makes applesauce for socio-ecological change. She links theory and practice as a co-founder and operator of the queer feminist sociocultural center Haus des Wandels, or House of Change, or House of Transformation, in East Brandenburg, not so far from Berlin, as an editor of the think and research space Oya, which is, I think, grandchildren compatible living is the phrase. I'm sure we'll hear more about that. Also as a research assistant at the chair of environmental and technological sociology at BTU Cottbus, as advisory board member of Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie, and as friend, sister, mother, and aunt. She's published widely on degrowth, commoning ecofeminism and convivial technology, and her books can also be found on the book table that we have in the community space. So welcome, and could you position yourself in this space? Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you a lot for this nice introduction and for having me here. I'm totally thrilled to learn more about fashion, and I really thank you, Sandra, for having this wonderful start and giving us this notion of the fashion with the capital F and with the small f. I really like that very much. Yeah, I come, as you already said, from the field of degrowth research. And originally, I'm not an economist. I come also from cultural anthropology. And then somehow I dived into that field of degrowth for the same reasons as you, maybe. Just seeing like what is at stake. And I'm not sure if I should talk now more about degrowth or later.
Maybe we'll come to the more detailed evaluation later, and we'll introduce the other panelists.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about my blouse. Is that the right English word? Because as you introduced your blouse, this blouse, it's from my elderly neighbor Ingrid, because at our house we have a big free box where our neighbors like give clothing they don't need anymore, and we take them. Also, we give clothes that we don't need anymore. And so I'm very proud now to be able to sit here with this blouse of Ingrid, who's really cool. Like, she's a 75-year-old neighbor, and is helping us out a lot and knows a lot about different kinds of subsistence technologies. Maybe I will talk about her and other friends later.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Ray, we now come to you. And thank you for joining us online. You said that teaching for me has always come from a point of care first, and that you know that design can be the solution. Ray Rahimur Rahman is a multi-talented artist, designer, filmmaker, and lecturer. His work delves into the challenges of heritage and contemporary material and spatial design, often at the intersection of craft-based technologies, disciplines. Drawing from his lived experience as a South Asian Muslim gay man who grew up below the poverty line in East London, Rahman's work is deeply rooted in the narratives of everyday life, and he brings a unique perspective to his work that reflects his commitment to social knowledge and community engagement, using his platform to give voice to underrepresented communities. And in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the field, Rahman has been nominated for numerous awards, including the Changemakers Prize by the British Fashion Council last year, and the Outstanding Contribution Award by the British Bangladeshi Fashion Council in 2019 and last year. Ray, can I also invite you to position yourself within this space? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so sad that I'm not there with you all. I guess to position myself in this conversation is across probably quite a few professions that I have, one being as a first-year leader for the BA Fashion at Central St. Martin's, and actually teaching the idea of degrowth to both students and staff who are currently practicing in the fashion industry. And then also from coming from working with craft communities where the idea of degrowth is probably a very new thing to them because they're still growing and they actually don't have anything to degrow from. But I think that my positionality is from those, probably from those two areas.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome again. And Samira Iran, who's joining us from here, Berlin. Samira is a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the Technical University Berlin and a project lead at Hot or Cool Institute in Germany. Her PhD thesis worked on the topic of sharing economy and the clothing industry. And she's currently consortium lead of a citizen science project on decluttering and sustainable consumption at the Technical University and a project lead of a project on care economy and sustainable consumption. Besides, she's a co-founder of Fashion Revolution Iran and a member of the executive committee of Sustainable Fashion Consumption Network. And the quotation I chose from a report that you co-wrote last year is that fashion consumption is highly unequal between and within countries. On average, the emissions of the richest 20% were 20 times higher than the emissions of the poorest 20%. The richest 20% would have to reduce their footprint by 83% in the UK, 75% in Italy and Germany. And again, I invite you to position yourself within this space of degrowth fashion.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and hello to you and everyone. Didn't have the time before we start to say hello. So, yeah, you introduced me already. I am a researcher. I'm working since 2011 in the field of sufficiency in the fashion consumption field. And yeah, and my main focus on research interest is minimalism, sufficiency, degrowth, and but today I would like to focus on the topic of inequality and bring a little bit in this regard to the conversation. And as you mentioned about your clothes, I got encouraged also to tell you something about my clothes, which might be interesting for our discussion. My outfit is made out of unwanted fashion items, unsold in the factories in Iran, because they were made, and at some point the producers thought, well, we don't want to sell them, so we just threw them away. And a designer who is who happens to be also my friend, Toktam Hemmati, in Iran, made this outfit, and today maybe I can tell you a little bit why this is not the best solution we can have for future.
Thank you very much. I think it's great to be able to ground also this discussion in the materiality of what we're wearing. I want to briefly mention this look at this rising discourse around degrowth. So degrowth is a term that I'm sure we're all familiar with. It's been almost a kind of buzzword, or it's much more prominent in the last couple of years, and we've seen almost a discursive explosion around this term about 2-3 years ago, with a series of conferences already happening in the mid-2000s. And then, of course, the pandemic gave rise to the degrowth debate and a growing acceptance that capitalism, so fundamentally a growth-based economic system, and we have this great image of the lilies in the pond, has resulted in a number of social and ecologic crises. So we see this discursive explosion, and at the same time, there's a historical context there that's really important. You already mentioned the Club of Rome, the limits of growth in '72. So there was a moment in the mid to late '60s and the early '70s where people were questioning this model, and were already talking about the limits of growth in the global West. And this is really more or less a snapshot of sort of a global Western discourse. There is, of course, Kohei Sato's system failure, I think it's called in English. Degrowth communism. Ah, thank you. And then at the same time, you don't have, it's not an accepted degrowth debate. There's also criticism. So in 2020, I think in April, it was the Spectator ran an article talking about the misery of degrowth. So there's this image of sort of lessening and having less. And interestingly, also for those who want to delve into this discursive explosion, is to look at the manifesto for the Netherlands that was published in 2020, that lists sort of 5 principles. But with this very brief sort of look into, okay, what is the discourse here? I want to lead us into a space where we talk about the term a little bit, understand what does that actually mean, and what does it mean in relation to fashion and education. Here you can also see 2 of Andrea's books, Degrowth, and then The Future of Degrowth, which is an English translation extended version, I think. And I think what's also interesting that you published this book, the Degrowth book in German, in 2019. So maybe you can talk a bit about your understanding of degrowth and also the moment pre the discursive explosion.
Yeah. This is really funny to hear your introduction to say, like, degrowth is a term you might all be familiar with. So this is, as somebody who is working on degrowth for over 10 years now, we wouldn't have expected this to happen 10 years ago. Everybody be familiar with the term, so I think in itself this is a good thing. Of course, we want to grow in our own ideas, right? Yeah, maybe to start with a common misunderstanding like this misery of degrowth thing, I think a very crucial point that from the start of the discourse we were always saying your recession is not our degrowth. Degrowth is exactly about not having the misery of a recession, because what we see now in different countries is there is, like in different early industrialized countries, there is no more growth. This is the one point, and this leads to recession, and this leads to multiple social problems. And the other point is, as we already heard by Sandra's talk, like there is the massive urgency to reduce resource extraction and consumption. And I think most like educated people all over the planet agree in we have to reduce the resource extraction and consumption. But the big disagreement is whether this is possible within the capitalist system or not. And the basic controversy is about whether it is possible to decouple 2 lines of growth. And the one line is the growing of the GDP. This means the annual amount of money circulating within a national economy. And this is growing. And all kinds of politics, like 95% of politics worldwide, are based on the assumption that this curve of GDP growing can be decoupled from the other curve of resource extraction and consumption. So I will have to lay down my microphone to show you. Like this. See the curves? The curves, they are going parallel. for like 150 years now. And there sometimes is such a thing like a relative decoupling, so the curve of resource extraction is not growing as fast as the GDP. But there's no such thing which we would need to be able to tackle all these global environmental problems you were talking about. There's no such thing as an absolute decoupling, like resource extraction is going down, everything is flowing in a circular economy, and GDP is still going up. And we cannot see this empirically, we just cannot see, and there's also some discussion if maybe theoretically it's also not possible. Actually, I think we don't have to delve into this here. We don't have to be all economic experts or thermodynamical experts to say whether this would be in theory possible or not. But we see that we're in a state of urgency where we have to reduce our emissions in the next 10 years very much. And as this decoupling is not possible at the moment, it is just from a moral point of view, it's a hazardous thing to still advocate for growth. It's a self-destroying path. And this means growth on a global level. Of course, this means not like every country and every person has to lower their standard of living. This would be obscene. No, it's about global ecological justice. So if we have like an absolute cap of resources we can use, and if we are people interested in justice, as I think maybe all of you in the room and a lot of people on all of the planet are, we have to think about another type of society and of economy that is about giving a fair share to each person on this planet. So this could mean growth for a lot of countries of the global south if people there desired to grow. This could also mean some path of post-development where people would say, no, what we need is a total other kind of development and other kinds of relationships and other kinds of economy. But that's not up like to, I would say, people from global north or global west to decide, but to give room for people on all continents to think about vernacular and local and commons-oriented economies. It is absolutely necessary that the early industrialized countries in the global north stop growing, because this gives space. Maybe I leave it here.
Thank you very much. Samira, you said in the conversation that we had before this panel that you absolutely agree with the values of the term, but you avoid it in writing. And maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, I didn't really avoid in writing. I see that sometimes in a specific publication, people avoid this term. And I can understand this because doing research, as I said, on sufficiency and minimalism and all those, using all those terms, when I, if you Google, for example, sufficient consumption, the images that you see are different than when you Google something like minimalist lifestyle. You know, they have a lot in common: degrowth, sufficiency, minimalism. They have something in common. Of course, one term like degrowth is more like economically used or something like it. But they have a lot of aspects in common. But looking at minimalist lifestyles or minimalism tips or books or I don't know, whatever, they all look nice. They you see usually a white background, like a kind of a nice plant on the side, everything very clean, in order. But do we see this image if we talk about degrowth or sufficiency? I don't think so. These are more like political terms. And that's why I think, however, like as you said, like you defined degrowth the best. I cannot say anything to that, but I just wanted to say that for me, degrowth and sufficiency have to do with increasing like well-being, like individual and social well-being. And this is a positive message. But I question always myself, does this term really bring this message to the audience? Or does, like, I don't know, this is a question. So yeah, I think we need to think about the terms and what kind of message they deliver to which audience. And yeah, so I think that's what I wanted to, I think, mention. Yeah.
Thank you. And Ray, while your output isn't writing, as it is for Andrea and Samira, but is design and education, you seem to engage in degrowth and defashion practices through the work you're doing, very much design work and education work. So maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, no, exactly for that. Because for us as practical, like education, like teachers of to design students, degrowth is something quite hard to teach them. So if anything, I mean, this is more for myself. Exactly, this is the way that I teach it. Is that degrowth isn't a word that I would use with them. A lot of the times when the students come to us, like, to be honest, we ask them to almost grieve. We almost need our students to almost like grieve the industry that they grew up loving, the designers that they love to see, the shows, the big F fashion, like the thing that we were talking about earlier, that whole world that they've all seen growing up since they were like 7 or 8, and is the reason why they're at this design school to make. And we almost need them to grieve all of that in order for us to start again, in order for us to evaluate and then to redesign. Because a lot of the times when we're speaking about curriculum, yes, it sounds really great in Word, but actually when we have to like transfer that over into the practical, that's where a lot of the complications come up. Well, for me, but I think tying them to like emotional processes that are quite human really help us kind of move forward. And a lot of the times with the students, that is the best way to connect with them. And to be honest, for me, the idea of degrowth is actually grieving. It's actually like the way you would like a great love. And to be honest, I had to do the same thing before I had to start as well. Is a lot of the industry that I loved, I no longer have to see anymore because we don't need that. The world needs a different type of designer, a different type of maker, a different type of practical artisan. And we need to, as educators, really move with that as well. So I love the word of degrowth, but I think for fashion design students, sometimes it scares them because they've come to grow. And then they're just like, wait, immediately you're telling me to not grow. But actually, that's why we kind of beat around the bush, because actually in the end, they're with us the whole way. Just that title's not there.
Thank you very much. So maybe thinking about, what could degrowth mean in concrete terms, and maybe some of you are familiar with Ulrike Harman's book, The End of Capitalism, where she suggests let's concretely look at the war economy in the UK. That had to shrink very quickly in 1940, or let's look at the 70s, just before this sort of point of excess of the planetary boundaries. So look at concrete examples that history can give us. But I wonder if you could each say something, sort of give concrete examples or ideas around the realization of degrowth. Because in the face of capitalism, it seems daunting to many, unrealistic to others, the misery to a more conservative camp. Andrea?
Yeah, I'm still a bit at this, should we use the word degrowth, yes or no? And I would, this is a very interesting point with the grieving. And I think totally degrowth is not like the one and for all word to explain everything. It's more like a term that is very hard to be co-opted and that you can use in certain environments to disturb the discourse. But then also comes the question, what then? And then I think we need other words. And I would propose to use the word commons a lot, because if we don't think about clothing or about dress, for example, but also, of course, other fields of the human mode of living as commodities made within a market, how do we imagine them then? And I think the concept of commons, of like caring together for certain things, can help us here a lot. And this can be true on a very small level and also on a kind of middle level. And here I will try to give the examples. Like on a small level, I come a lot from our house, because that's where I make experiences, like examples like this free box, where you can share and think in another way of fashion, because there is such a lot of things already produced, right? Like all the planet is full of clothes, and there is no sense in all this throwing away. But what to do with all this materiality that is already here? Maybe if we just stop producing clothes now, we could at least go on for the next 50 years in upcycling the things that are there, in recycling them. At our house, there was a sewing workshop with elderly ladies who were socialized in a GDR. And for them, it is totally natural to only make new things out of old things that you don't use anymore. And they were not, or they objected the idea that they will work with new fabric. They said, no, we will never do that, because it's just not in their daily life practice. And I think there's a lot of these grannies and aunties and neighbors like this all over the planet. And why not go there and learn from them and think about this vernacular knowledge that is still there at a lot of places. And also thinking about clothing as a commons on a level of how could we organize the production of dress or of fabric in a way that is outside the market. I think here we can use the example of community-supported agriculture as an example, and it works like this, that there is a farm producing food, vegetables or corn or whatever is produced, and people, households, all pay a certain amount per month to have their share of the food. And like this, it is an interaction without market, because they also share the risk of the producers, right? And why couldn't we do this with clothing as well? Why couldn't we have a kind of a flat rate for a certain workshop or place where clothes is produced? Also a kind of help with our money, like as consumers, the production of wool or the production of other materials that clothing is made of, like thinking of totally other business models, kind of, that are not organized in the old style forms of how business operates for profit business, but to organize all kinds of production and circulation levels in ways outside of the market. I think this would be so interesting to me if there is already maybe things like this in the fashion world. I don't know. Or maybe you want to develop them in the next 2 days. That would be so great.
Thank you. I think, Samira, you can probably say something about that. And also, speaking of concrete terms, you brought some data, I think, that can elucidate this point.
Yeah, so do I remember the question right? You said, what are the realistic ideas? Okay.
Concrete
Like
needs and concrete steps.
Enjoying the conversation, I forgot the question. Yeah, I think Andrea brought up the main point here, which is about we don't need new clothing. That's, I think, the main point for me, that we don't need new production of new clothing. And that, yeah, so we also did, I'll just come back to this in a minute, but maybe I can just introduce this report that we published end of last year, which is called Unfit, Unfair, Unfashionable, together with other colleagues, led by a colleague of mine, Luca Koshimo. We had a look at clothing consumption in G20 countries. And then we tried to see how much carbon emission is caused by clothing consumption in these countries. And then we also developed a few scenarios where we thought, okay, how can we reduce this carbon footprint in the future? And there we thought about efficiency scenarios, like, for example, using a better fiber, for example, or also sufficiency scenarios, like, for example, reducing the amount of, or not, for example, it's about reducing the amount of production and consumption. And what we realized is that with efficiency-related strategies, we are not able to meet the environmental goals that we have to meet. We need sufficiency goals. So here in this graph, you can see a green area where we called it fair consumption space. This is the area where we can all live in by satisfying our need for clothing while not crossing the ecological boundaries. And then you can see by these green-black dots where the countries are going to end up by their clothing consumption if they don't change anything in the way they are right now behaving. And the green dots are showing what happens if they implement basically sufficiency-related strategies. You can see that most of the countries then are coming into this fair consumption space, while some high-income countries actually even implementing the sufficiency-based strategies, they cannot meet the goals, and they cannot come within the 1.5 degree limits. What does this graphic tell us is, first of all, the inequality that we see between the countries, right? Some countries like India and Brazil, they are already moving within this fair consumption space, while other countries are consuming much more. And also, what we don't see in this graph, but Renate mentioned in the beginning, we see a lot of inequalities also within the countries. So even when we look at what happens within one country, we can see that high-income population in one country is much more responsible for the environmental problem than the lowest income population. So when we talk about solutions, now I come back to the question finally, we cannot have a golden solution for everyone, because the solution that is working here in Germany is not the solution that must work for other countries. So I am more for local solutions. I think that's what we need. Example Andrea gave us can be a great local solution, like making an ecosystem for the fashion. But something that I think we need to know for us living in high-income countries as a solution, that we also mentioned about it in our report, is that we need to stop purchasing new clothing. I mean, reusing, washing practices, all of these are important, they are impactful, but none of them is as impactful of just stop buying. And in the report, I can just quickly mention this, we recommend that just if you want to have a number, which most people like to have, the limit should be 5 pieces of clothing per year, not more than this. And even if you think about like buying secondhand would be an alternative, it's not. I mean, it's a little bit better, but it's not the solution. We need to stop producing and buying new pieces of clothing as much as we can. So that's what I wanted to mention now.
Thank you. And Ray, maybe you can say something about the concrete steps that you see in your area of education and design.
Yes, I'm just going to continue on as well from what I completely agree with a lot of things that Andrea and Samira were saying. But I think a lot of the times for me, it's when we deliver a lot of the stats and the data to the everyday person who could be a fashion design student or could be someone that you meet in Tesco or a Sainsbury's. I just think the bit that we almost need to do is convince them that actually to come away from a capitalistic system is actually going to be good for them. It's good for everybody else. And that convincing is, for me, the task. And a lot of the times, I just think it always just gets reduced to our idea of being loved and to love. And honestly, I apologize now, I'm an emotional person. So a lot of the times, everything's linked to an emotion. Just because whenever we think about degrowth and the need for this, I always think of a quote by Ursula de Castro, where she quotes, "The fashion industry just needs kindness." And to me, a lot of what we're talking about, it always comes down to this. And I always think about the first time I saw kindness in fashion was working with craft communities in Bangladesh. And very similar to what Andrea and Samira were saying, was that within the global south, actually they have taken the time to be slow. And while they're being slow in making things and taking their time to do everything, they're asking themselves where they're taking from as they're doing it. And I think the problem with globalization and capitalism is that there is no time to slow down to do those things. And ultimately, that's what we're asking everyone to do, whether they're shopping in a high street store or they're shopping at a luxury fashion store, or we're convincing them to buy upcycled, sustainable clothing, is we're asking them to slow down. We're asking them to just take that moment, to just kind of really question every little step that they're taking, very much like the craft communities. And that is what I love. That's what I love working in, and it's in that space. But for me, it always comes back to that beginning bit of how do we convince people to this way of life, because it's not new. And I think it always comes down to bringing it back to our idea of being loved and to love, and actually getting them to understand that actually slowing down is giving love to the world and taking love back by by what you wear and what you eat.
Thank you so much. I always want to use these as a closing words because it sets such a good tone. And with a view to the time, I know we have to come to an end, and I'm going to do something very anti-multi-log now and not open the floor for questions, but invite you to grab the speaker and ask questions directly, because we want to make sure that we have enough time to move over to the other building and you get settled into your workshop and into your spaces. But I really want to thank the three panelists for opening up this space for us in such a great and materially concrete and inspired way. Thank you so much, Andrea, Samira, and Ray.